Inviting me. This is my presentation, Birmingham Composers and Their Entertaining Rivalry. So the main story of this presentation is the development of peal compositions of Stedman Triples in the 19th century, for which the many talented Birmingham composers played a vital role towards. I'll try to place a focus on the composers themselves as people, so what they were like, the human side, and that has been made possible by this brilliant book. I don't know if you can see that. The Recollections of John Day, which many of you will have read. John Day was a 19th century Birmingham ringer who met many of the composers in this presentation, and he wrote wonderful memories all about the Birmingham ringers who he knew, which to my money is sort of the most unparalleled ringing history ever written. It's a real oral history, very, very entertaining reading, really places the human side on the subjects. So yeah, I'll be quoting freely from that as we go along. It's a bit difficult to talk about composers without talking about compositions. So I'll be explaining a lot about how the compositions work and why they were so revolutionary and all that kind of thing. So although this is a historical presentation, it's also very technical as well, sort of half historical, half technical. So I hope that'll be all right. I'll try to make it interesting. And if anyone has any questions as I'm going along, feel free to use the chat box and Arthur can stop me at a good point, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. And I'll occasionally make digressions of how these compositions are relevant, not just in the ringing world, but the greater mathematical world as well, which is quite interesting to look at, to see the bigger picture of things. So I'm afraid we actually start in Sheffield with a composer called William Hudson. Hudson made some very important contributions to Stedman Triples, which was to greatly influence the Birmingham ringers in the years shortly afterwards. We don't actually know much about Hudson as a person, well, I don't anyway. So this could be a line of research for someone to follow up. So this is mainly about Hudson, the composer, rather than Hudson, the person. Right. So we'll start with just a bit of a technical introduction before we get onto the more juicy bits. So why is Stedman Triples very difficult to compose? Well, composing a peal of any triples is a big mathematical challenge, because to ring a peal of triples, you ring all the 5,040 different possible rows on 7 bells. It's not like when you're ringing caters or sinks where you have a choice of the rows which occur in the peal. In triples, you have to ring all of the rows once and once only. So to compose a peal of triples is a big mathematical challenge. And composing a peal of Stedman triples is a really big mathematical challenge, because Stedman is constructed of units of 6 changes, sixes. So that means you have to compose a peal of Stedman triples, have to have 840 different sixes to join together, and you've got to make sure that all of those 840 sixes are different from each other, and there's no repeated changes or anything like that. So 846 is a massive number to put together, which is why it can be quite useful to break down the peal into parts. Each part is rung identically, and that way you only need to compose a fraction of the whole peal, because you're just composing a part of the peal. So as an example, if we look here, we start with rounds. I've missed off the treble because we're pretending this is just the lead ends of a composition, so the treble will always be at the front automatically. So we start off here with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What we can do is move around the little bells. So we stick bell number 4 on the front, and then we move bells 2 and 3 back one. So we've got 1, 4, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. Now we repeat the same operation again. This then produces 3, 4, 2, 5, 6, 7. And we've done exactly the same thing again. We've moved 4th place bell onto the front and put these 2 bells back here to get 3, 4, 2, 5, 6, 7. So yeah, so we use the same operation. Remember, we did this, move 4th space bell here to get 4, 2, 3. So we've done exactly the same thing again to get 3, 4, 2, 5, 6, 7. Then when we do the same thing again, we get back to where we started. We get back to rounds again. And so the important thing about this is that this is not a random selection of bell changes. It's a group in the mathematical sense. It's self-generating. So we only got this third one because the first one was 4, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. So a closed self-generating group of bell changes. And so if we wanted to, we could compose a peal of plain bob triples using this mathematical group of partends. And that way, instead of having to compose the whole peal in one block, we could just compose 1/3 of the peal using each of these as our partends. And that way, only needing to compose 1/3 of the peal, we've already made the job a little bit easier to compose the whole peal. Similarly, we've got another group of free partends here, but we've left 2, 3, and 4 this time unaffected, and we've got the bigger bells 5, 6, 7 rotating round. So same idea, it's just it's a different set of free bells rotating round this time for our free part. Now it gets a bit more interesting here because now we've got 9 partends. We've combined the first group that we looked at with the second group we've looked at. So we've got 2, 3, 4 and 5, 6, 7 moving around at the same time. And but this is already starting to get a bit more complicated because however we try to work it, this will always come back into rounds after just 3 parts. So we've got at the top here the ones that we looked at to start with, where 5, 6, 7 are always unaffected and 2, 3, 4 are rotating around. So that will come back into rounds after just 3 parts. We've got this one, the second one we looked at, where 7, 5, 6 are moving around. So this will come back to rounds after 3 parts. And even if we try to be a bit more imaginative and creative, we try and start with this one, 4, 2, 3, 7, 5, 6, where both groups of bells are moving. We then get 3, 4, 2, 6, 7, 5, and then back to rounds again after 3 parts. So that hasn't worked either. So we have to be a little bit more imaginative to joining all the 9 parts together. They don't just come together in a block like the 3 parts did. But lo and behold, here is an example. So here is a 9-part peal of bob triples using the 9 partends that we've considered. So the composer, some obscure American composer, I believe, he only needed to compose 1/9 of the peal because it's a 9-part. So that's even easier than composing just 1/3 of the peal. So breaking down into parts like this can be really useful. Now Hudson, William Hudson, who we looked at just now, he's best remembered in ringing composition for providing this group of partends, very big group, 60 partends here. And again, it's the same. This isn't just a random selection of bell changes, but these are related to each other mathematically as a mathematical group. And just as the 9-part was 3 parts joined together, so this is lots of little groups joined together to make one big group of 60 partends. And so we can see that composing a peal of Stedman triples or any triples is now much easier because you only need to compose 1/60th of the peal by using these partends. That means you only need to compose 84 changes, which is 1/60th of the 5040 changes. So this makes it much, much easier to put together the peal, especially of Stedman triples. Now, if we look at these 6s in Stedman triples, because I said that Stedman triples is made up of units of 6 changes, this is the start of the plain course. So we've got 6-1 here and 6-2 here. And we can see that bells 2, 3, 4 come together on the front of the 6, while the other bells just keep dodging and coming back to the same combinations again. And here in 6-2, we've got bells 4, 3, 6 coming together on the front of the 6, whilst the other bells again come back into the same combination again. But this means that if we try to use this free part that we looked at, these 3 partends here, it won't work because you see we've got 2, 3, and 4 rotating here, just like we looked at earlier on. But this means whenever we ring 6-1 in each part, it'll be the same changes repeated because we've got 2, 3, 4 coming together on the 6. These bells keep coming back to the same combination. So whenever in part 1 and part 2, part 3, we get to this 6-1, it'll always be false. We'll always get repeated changes. So we can't use these partends here. And similarly, we can't have a free part where bells 4, 3, 6 keep rotating around because then it'll always be false whenever we get to 6-2 in each respective part. And actually working on that logic, we can't have any kind of free part with any trio of free bells rotating at the part ends because there's always got to be some 6 somewhere where those 3 bells always come together on the front. So we can't have just free parts with groups of free bells cycling around. And now the great thing about Hudson's group is, although it's a very large group, it's got 60 part ends. None of those 60 part ends compare to any of the others by rotating a set of just 3 bells. So if we look at this one, which is sort of like rounds 2, 3, 1, 4, 5, 6, we could try rotating 2, 3, 1 to get 3, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. And if we look for it in our table, look all around, we can't find it. It's not there, which is good. We don't want it to be there. Instead, we can try and rotate bells 4, 5, 6 to get 2, 3, 1, 6, 4, 5. We have a look again all around our table, can't find it. We've got this one, 3, 1, 2, 6, 4, 5, but that's not quite the same because these 2, 3, and 1 have rotated as well. So again, it's not in there. We could try rotate maybe 3, 1, 4, so to get 2, 1, 4, 3, 5, 6. So we look all around our table. We've got some a bit similar, but not quite the same. So that's not there either. We could try 1, 5, 6. We look all around. Again, it's not there. So I promise you, try this at home. Try and take any of these and just rotate 3 bells. You won't be able to find the coarse end. And that's good because it means it avoids that falseness problem we looked at just now, where 3 bells come together on the front and the 6. So this is why Hudson's group is so good for composing peals of Stedman and Erin triples as well. So this is the peal that Hudson supposedly composed in 1814. And it's a significant improvement on the earlier peal of Stedman triples, which was a very notorious difficult 1 part, so very difficult to conduct and learn. Whereas this one is broken down into very nice 60 part chunks, so fairly easy to learn and conduct. So it was a real improvement on the earlier peals prior to this. Now, I said supposedly composed by Hudson, and this is because there was another composer, Joseph Tebbs, also of Yorkshire, and the peal is actually attributed to him rather than Hudson. But there's a letter to a newspaper that Hudson wrote where he claimed the composition was his own. So he said, "Sir, you are incorrect with respect to the first 10-part peal, or 60-part peal. 'Twas I who made the discovery in 1814, though I did not give the peal to Mr. Tebbs till the year 1818. Had it been the production of that gentleman, it would have appeared in Mr. Shipway's work." So that would seem to validate the peal as being by Hudson. But another composer, John Lates, wrote this reply, where he said, "The peal of Stedman's triples now claimed by your Sheffield correspondent was published in Mr. Tebbs' name by J. Powell, and in his work on that system, and presented by that gentleman to the exercise generally." So it's a bit unclear, a bit murky waters. It could be by Hudson or by Tebbs. We often attribute it to Tebbs, but it's probably not really sure. So just as a digression, it's interesting to look at Hudson's group in the greater world of mathematics. Hudson's group occurs in other areas of ringing composition, especially on 6 bells. But it's very well known in mathematics. It's very elementary family of Lie groups, and it's so well known to mathematicians that most of them have probably forgotten about it because it's so elementary and trivial. It can also be visually represented as a shape, like in the picture here, as a icosahedron or a dodecahedron, which is the jewel of an icosahedron. And so you can actually compose touches by writing out lead ends on the different sides of the shape, and then you can sort of turn the shape in your hands to compose touches, this way for a bob, this way for a plain lead, and things like that. And so some composers have actually composed touches by using shapes in this way. Now, change ringers are often considered to be the first group theorists, the first people to use mathematical groups before groups were properly formalized in mathematics. So the question is, who came first, Hudson or the mathematicians? Now, there's this famous mathematician, Galois, who catalogued many of the elementary groups. He was one of the first people to properly write down and understand about groups. So the question is, did he know about Hudson's group or not? Peter Newman has translated, famous mathematician who's translated lots of Galois' works, or all of the works, and he claims that Galois didn't know about Hudson's group, whereas other mathematicians say that Galois did know about Hudson's group. So we're not really sure about that one. But in any case, when Hudson composed the peal in 1814, Galois was only aged 3. So luckily, it seems likely that the chain ringers did get first on this occasion, which is quite nice to know. Prior to Galois, if anyone who knew about Hudson's group, they might have discovered it in its shape form, particularly the ancient Greeks who liked playing around with shapes and things like that. So Hudson's group might have been known in its shape form. Now, if you're still awake, we can talk about some Birmingham composers finally. So we'll start with Thomas Day, who was the uncle of John Day, who I mentioned in the recollections at the start, wrote the recollections of the Birmingham Ringers. And John Day was very, very fond of his uncle. So there's plenty of anecdotal stuff in his recollections about this composer, Thomas Day. Thomas Day composed from an early age and grew up to be a very, very talented composer. And John Day writes about his uncle. A good part of my childhood was spent at my grandparents' house, and my uncle, Thomas Day, being unmarried, lived with them. I used to wonder why he was always doing sums, since every scrap of suitable paper, the backs of merchants' orders, or anything else that came his way, were quickly covered with figures, and such figures. He used the stump of a quill pen, which did not leave the paper from the beginning of a row to the end, the figures running into each other so that they took a lot of making out by anybody but himself. This would be at the time that he was working at his first long peal of treble bob major, which, so I've heard him say, he finished proving on December 17th, 1832. This was the same day on which the chairing of the first member of Parliament for Birmingham took place. He used to say, while our Sam was at the meetings, I was proving treble eight. Now, throughout his life, Day was continually working to try and increase the length of his long peal of treble bob major. And it's worth pointing out that composing treble bob major is much more difficult than composing plain bob major, because you get lots of internal falseness caused by the treble bobbing of the treble. So this was a very big theoretical challenge that Thomas Day was trying to work on. Now, Thomas Thurstans, another Birmingham composer, had also been trying to compose long peals of treble bob major, independently of Day. And this resulted in another story given by John Day. When Thurstans was working at treble bob major with the tenors parted, which resulted in his peal of 15,840 changes, he sent a great number of papers to Thomas Day. Day used to look them over and put them in an old hat, which he kept for the purpose, and the hat was nearly full before Thurstans produced a true peal. On one Sunday afternoon, on my way to see my uncle, I met Cresser coming away from his house. Cresser told me he had just taken another peal to be looked over, and when I arrived, I found my uncle very intent on the figures. Knowing that it was of no use to speak to him while he was so occupied, I sat down and waited quietly for him to break the silence, and he did so presently, with his usual, "Yes, yes, this'll do. If he alters these 3 courses with the 7th in 5th place, I believe it will run true." The alteration was made, and the peal was true. Thurstans was much pleased with his success, and went to see Day, thinking he had superseded the others' peals, but this was not so, because Day had a peal of the same number, of which he had said nothing, not even having mentioned it to me. Thurstans was rather annoyed when he learnt this, and could not help showing his pique, so that when he was leaving, Day told him that if he sent any more peals to be looked at, he hoped he would send him something of his own. For what you have sent hitherto is nearly all my own work. Now, Day increased the length of his treble bob major peal to well over 16,000 changes, and his nephew wrote that, while engaged proving this peal, he gave strict orders to his housekeeper not to disturb him on any account, and she assured me that he sat out the fire in his room 3 times in one day. He didn't manage to compose a longer peal than this, but he discovered 12 new leads, which could be incorporated into the peal to make it longer, but he couldn't find a way of dovetailing in these 12 new leads that he found. And he said despondently, "I can't quite see, perhaps someone else may." It seems that Thomas Day was kind-hearted, but would give his opinions without fear or favour. In 1865, the ringing author Saltonstall visited Birmingham, hoping to get his new ringing textbook published in Birmingham, and so he visited Day's house to show him the new book. Day had already formed a rather unfavourable opinion of it and criticised it very freely while they were going through it. When they came to Holt's one-part peal of Granser Triples and Saltonstall's variation of it, he fairly lost his temper, and looking Saltonstall in the face, said, "So you could not let that alone, eh? I'd be ashamed of myself if I were you." After that outburst, he took very little notice of the book or what was in it. When the book was published, Saltonstall sent him a copy. Now, I think it's interesting that when people approach the end of their lives, we often hear stories about how they destroy items of great personal value, even if it's something they've been working on or creating or building. We often hear that they destroy it in the last moments of or in their last days of their life. And possible motives are they might feel they've wasted their lives spending so much time on these precious items, or they might be worried that some enemy might get their hands on it after they've died. And so it seems that the same thing happened to Thomas Day's composition papers, as written by John Day just after his uncle's death. I had lent him the first volume of Snowdon's book Treble Bob. That night he was unwell and in a despondent mood, spoke of the work in the book as labour in vain and time thrown away. But as I had heard him speak in the same strain before, I did not take much notice. This was on the Saturday, and on the next Thursday morning I was met on my way to business with news of his death. For some time previous he'd been living entirely alone, some friends in the next house seeing to his wants. He was last seen by them at 10 p.m. and when he was preparing to retire for the night. The next morning, Thursday, about 7 o'clock, when the woman went to see his fire, she found him lying at the foot of his stairs. This was on the 10th of April, 1879, in his 76th year, and it was a great shock to us all. After the funeral, one of the first things I thought about was the collection of his books and papers. Those relating to his private affairs I found without trouble, but of his own ringing books and papers, absolutely nothing. These books were lying on his table when I left him for the last time. He had written particulars of the peals in which he had taken part, many of his own compositions, and a number by other composers, including Fieldhouse, Short, Cooper, Thurston, Stokes, and Edwards of Stourbridge, with other matters that interested him during his ringing career. Besides this, he had a fair-sized book of foolscap in paper covers made by himself, which was full of his own work, proof scales, and other matters. I never had an opportunity for a good look over the latter. Whenever he had occasion to refer to it in my presence, he would put it away again, hinting that I should not understand it. Both these books, I can imagine, would have been of very great interest, but some way or other they disappeared, and how will always remain a mystery. So to continue with the development of Stedman Triples' peal compositions and Birmingham's important contribution to this, here is the peal that Day composed in 1827 at the age of 24, so still very young when he composed this. This is on a similar idea to the peal we looked at earlier, the Hudson Tebbs peal being a 60-part, and we do know that Day was in correspondence with Joseph Tebbs, so it seems likely that he was influenced by the earlier peal. Now, another famous Birmingham composer called Henry Cooper asked Day for a copy of the composition, but Day was a bit reluctant because he knew that Cooper was not a very trustworthy character, but he did give the composition to Cooper, warning him that another composer also had the figures as well. And sure enough, not long afterwards, on the Light 8 at St. Martin's, Birmingham, they rang a wonderful new composition of Stedman Triples by Henry Cooper. But when Day looked at the composition, it turned out just to be a variation of Day's composition, disguised so you couldn't tell it was Day's composition very easily. And Day was so angry about this that he resigned from the St. Martin's use and didn't enter the ringing chamber again for over 20 years. But luckily justice was done because the St. Martin's use entered the composition in their peal book, attributing it to John Day rather than Henry Cooper. So I'm always quite relieved when I hear that justice was done. And the reason the composition is so good is because if you look at it, there are very few consecutive calls. There are never more than 2 consecutive calls. So here we've got Bob and a single next to each other, and then single Bob, but never more than 2 calls in a row, which is a very good feature and far better than any of the earlier peals of Stedman Triples up to that time. And even now, it's quite rare to find a composition which has more than 2 calls in a row of Stedman Triples. So it became a very, very popular composition for a few years. This could be a good time for me to answer any questions if there are any. Otherwise, I'll just carry on.
There's nothing in the chat box at the moment. I had a question though, Richard.
Yeah, sure.
And this will give other people an opportunity if they have anything to pipe up or type away. You mentioned before about the dispute being aired in the Era newspaper, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was a national newspaper.
Yeah.
I just wondered what I mean. You can't really imagine that these days, a sort of dispute happening in something like the Times or the Telegraph. So I wondered whether based on your reading, whether you're aware of kind of a wider interest in like national media, I guess, or national newspapers for kind of disputes of this kind, because it's something that I just can't really imagine happening today. It happens in the ringing world, but not so much in national.
Yeah, well, I think the reason was, Arthur, this was before the days of the ringing world, long before the ringing world, and also before Bell News, which came before the ringing world. So there wasn't really any other means for ringers to communicate except for in the national newspapers. So it seems in several national newspapers you get disputes and different interest stories about ringing and that kind of thing, just because it was one of the only ways to communicate nationally, really. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's it.
Hundreds of years before the days of Facebook and so on, social media. So
yes, yeah, that's right. And also not many collections of compositions either. So compositions sometimes got published in newspapers and things, or at least described in newspapers and things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. The chat box is very, very quiet. I don't know if anyone wants to sort of put their hand up or unmute themselves.
No. That's fine. I probably sent people to sleep.
Not at all, not at all. All right, I think in that case, we'll plough on if you're happy.
Okay, brilliant. So we now move to 1832. Another spectacular goal was scored by Sheffield in 1832, again by William Hudson, who we met at the start. And if you have rung a quarter or a peal of Stedman Triples, and I imagine that a great many of you probably have done, it's very likely the composition you rang had the bobs coming in pairs, which means that whichever bell you're ringing, you always go in alternately quick and slow, alternately, no matter which bell you're ringing, which is obviously a very useful feature. And so the composition we're looking at now was the first composition on this plan, and it was pioneered by William Hudson. And we now call this the twin bob plan because of the bobs always coming in pairs. And again, it's another composition on Hudson's group of 60 part ends, which is why there's so much repetition when we look at the composition on paper. And yeah, so most of the calls in the composition come at positions 3, 4, 5, and 6. And in more modern twin bob notation, that looks like this, S and H, which might look more familiar to some of you. And in other twin bob compositions, we have these extra calling positions at L and Q. And so not only was Hudson's peal very easy to learn, but it also contained very few calls compared to the earlier compositions of Stedman Triples. So it was a real breakthrough, and it sort of set a new course for peal compositions of Stedman Triples over the next 80 years, really, including the famous saga between our next 2 Birmingham composers. The first of these is Thomas Thurstans, who's still a very, very well-known name associated with Stedman Triples. And a lesser-known fact, he was also a very good, capable heavy bell ringer. So he rang the heavier bells at St Martin's in the Bull Ring to some of the longer length peals in 1820. And he also actually conducted those peals as well. So he's a pretty competent ringer. John Day, reliable as always with his recollections, leaves us a wealth of anecdote about Thurstans. About the year 1830, My father kept a public house, the Bell, in Smallbrook Street, and a frequent visitor to the house was a man whom I used to hear spoken of as Tommy Thurstans. He was looked upon by my parents as somewhat of a nuisance, being generally noisy and intoxicated. Possibly that was the reason I noticed him at so early an age. I only remember ringing with him once when I was a very young hand, and he made a not very complimentary remark about my striking, but it did me no harm. I have heard both my uncle and Henry Johnson say that his great fault as a composer was his lack of patience to prove his work. About the year 1846, there was a great stir about treble bob triples. Thomas Day had produced a peal, and Lates by some means had got one, while Day and Cooper had also produced touches. Thurstans, on hearing a touch rung, tried his hand in that direction, and submitted a number of touches to Johnson, not one of which was true. He made a final effort and said that if that was not true, it was impossible to get a true touch, and Day's and Cooper's must be false. But like all the rest, his final effort was false. Apart from all this, I have heard Johnson, my uncle, and others say that no man of his time understood the theory of composition more than he did, but that he jumped at conclusions which were often erroneous. By trade, he was a brass finisher, and up to 1825 or thereabouts, was a quiet and respectable man. About that time, there was a trade dispute resulting in a strike, and through leaving his work in an unfinished state, he was summoned before the magistrates, who in the then existing state of the law had the power to send him to prison. This they did for a month's hard labour in Warwick jail. There can be no doubt that this disgrace totally upset him. And though steady and right enough at times, on others he would break out and act more like a madman than anything else. We used to also think he had been jilted in a love affair, for when he had a fit on, if anyone said anything to him relating to women, and I'm sorry to say this was sometimes done on purpose, it would make him 10 times worse. In fact, I and one or two others always avoided him at these times, as they generally lasted for weeks until he became dirty and ragged, and a fit of illness put an end to it. The last time I remember seeing him, he was respectably dressed in black, I think in mourning for his sister, with whom he had lived for many years. He was carrying a basket of soil, which he had been getting for his window plants. He told me he was unwell and could not work. That was in the spring of 1858, and in the autumn of that year, Mr. T. Cole went to Johnson and told him that poor Tom was dead. We were led to suppose that he had a breakout and was taken ill in the street, it was said with English cholera. He was taken to the General Hospital and there died. No one knew who he was, and no one inquired about him, so it came to pass that the parish authorities buried him, no friend or relative being near. Now we'll look at the career of Thurston's great rival, John Lates. Unlike Thurstans, John Lates was not a through and through Birmingham man, although he grew up in Walsall, not too far away, but he learnt to ring in Oxford on his training to become an upholsterer. John Day, not Lates, John Day was taught to ring at St Philip's, Birmingham by William Chattel, after Chattel had fallen out with the old band at St Philip's, not to mention most of the other Birmingham ringers as well, and Chattel had to teach a new band from scratch. Day recalls how Lates started to join them on Sunday mornings. Things were working quietly and surely for a change, for one very fine Sunday morning in the month of May, a spare, gentlemanly man came into the belfry who was looking ill and was closely muffled and buttoned up. Chattel, after expressing his surprise at seeing him, had a long and friendly chat with him, during which it transpired that our visitor had been very ill, suffering from inflammation of the lungs. He was then getting better and promised to come again. And after he had gone, Chattel told me that that was Mr. Lates, speaking very highly of his ability as a composer. After this, Lates came up pretty frequently, and one of the young ones stood out so that he might have a pull. Lates usually conducted, and the band began to make rapid progress. He was about 5 feet 8 inches in height, a bit of a dandy in dress, and very gentlemanly in manner. He had an impediment in his speech, which I cannot very well describe. It was not a stammer, but as if his tongue were too long and got in the way of the words he wished to utter. There can be no doubt he had great ability as a composer. In treble bob major, his 5024 stands unsurpassed, and in short, there are good peals of his in each of the standard methods, since he always aimed at excellence. Lates was especially clever as a listener to ringing, and while so engaged would make imaginary fingers with the forefinger of his right hand on the palm of his left. He would make the bobs as they were called and say what the coarse end should be, so that very soon he would have the whole plan of a peal before him by simply listening. His memory too was perfectly wonderful in these matters, as he would go home and commit to paper anything that particularly struck him. This gift of his was very well understood by the best men in the exercise, since from time to time he gave numerous proofs of it. When my uncle, Thomas Day, was practicing for his treble bob triples, Lates, by listening and chatting about it, discovered how it was worked, composed a peal, and got it rung in Christleton in Cheshire. This sort of thing caused Lates to be disliked. My uncle was particularly annoyed about the treble bob triples, and after speaking pretty freely to Lates about it, let it fall through. When stricken down with his last illness in 1858, Lates sent for Chattel and gave him his manuscript books and papers. These are in Henry Johnson's care for some little time, and when I received them from him, I addressed him somewhat as follows. Well, Harry, you have now seen what he has left behind him, and now tell me, what do you think of it all? I often think of him as he put his hand on my shoulder, looked me full in the face, and replied, John, he was a clever fellow. And so no doubt he was, and had he, with the other composers of which Birmingham could boast, when at their best, worked together in harmony instead of trying to overreach each other and giving away to petty jealousy, as it always appeared to me they did, what might they not have accomplished? Lates was always courteous and gentlemanly in manner, and always spoke grammatically, although he had a few choice expletives which he used to throw in when unusually elated or surprised. He died on March 22nd, 1858, in his 60th year, and was buried in St. Philip's Churchyard on the north side near the Tower. I think it's interesting to consider the differences between Thurstans and Lates, despite the common prize they were fighting over. So Day says that often Thurstans would be standing at his door in shirt sleeves, pipe in mouth, waiting to have a chat with Chattel, as Chattel and John Day would walk past near Thurstan's home after ringing at St. Philip's, because Thurstans lived very, very near to St. Philip's. And Thurstans would ask the young band, ask about the young band, give his opinion as to their progress, and generally work his way around to Lates and Stedman Triples, since Lates and he were both hard at work at the time trying to improve the peal. So what were the differences between Lates and Thurstans, despite the common goal they were both fighting over? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Thurstans was a very fine, heavy bell ringer and rang the heaviest working bell for the long peals at St. Martin's in the 1820s. Day writes, it was plain to see that he had been a very strong man, as he was very wide from shoulder to hip. Now, Lates, on the other hand, is described as a ringer. He was not very remarkable, and his manner of handling a bell was peculiar and somewhat awkward. Whilst ringing, he stood very erect, with his legs close together, seeming to pull entirely from his elbows, and with little or no motion in his body. Consequently, the bell he rang had to go fairly well. Thurstans was described to act like a madman during his dreadful Beethovenish outbursts, whereas Lates is always painted to be civilized and courteous. Lates has an academic, scholarly feel about him, being quite well spoken and having learnt to ring in Oxford, being the son of a professor of music, whilst Thurstans always comes across as a sort of coarse survivor of the working class, an unprivileged pauper, if you like. Lates was married and had 4 children. Thurstans, again, like Beethoven, was a perpetual bachelor, and his bad temper always became far worse at the mere mention of women. Lates died in 1858, presumably close to his family and friends, and was buried at the church where he rang. Thurstans also died in 1858, but in an undignified and tragic state, amongst complete strangers, after one of his outbursts. Nobody knew who he was. He had no funeral, And as with Mozart this time, we do not know where he is buried. So what is it that our two heroes, Lates and Thurstans, were trying to do? What were they competing to do? They were competing to compose a peal of Stedman triples that only contained 2 singles, and also to ensure that the peal contained ordinary singles, just like the ones we ring today, because most of the earlier compositions of Stedman triples had unusual singles. So what they were really trying to do was improve Stedman triples and provide the indispensable peal composition, just as John Holt had done about 90 years earlier for Granser triples. And so there was a series of peals which both Lates and Thurstans produced. I won't bore you by going through the details of every one. So I know this presentation is being recorded, so if anyone wants to look at the YouTube video later, you can pause the video on these slides and look, read about the peals. And so Lates starts off with a false peal. Thurstans comes back with another false peal. Lates then responded with a 20-part peal, which was true, probably the first 20-part composition ever composed. Thurstans comes back with another peal, but it wasn't really much of an improvement. Then there's this 5th peal, which had a disputed authorship at the time. There was a big controversy about it because no one knew whether it was composed by Lates or Thurstans. Eventually, it was generally established that Lates had composed it, and the style of the composition seems to, I think, support that. And some of the older ringers in Birmingham were also adamant that Lates had composed the peal. So generally, we accredit the peal to Lates these days. And this was almost there because it only contained 2 singles, but they were special, unusual singles. They weren't the ordinary singles like we ring today. So we were very, very nearly there, but not quite there. And in the next 4 years, it was rung many times because it was still the best peal of Stedman triples yet composed. And finally, in 1846, the challenge was solved. Thurstans composed his masterpiece, as we call it now, in 1846. And so this contains 240 bobs and only 2 ordinary singles. It became the indispensable composition of Stedman triples for the next, well, a long, long time afterwards, to such an extent that composition activity in Stedman triples ceased for several decades after that. As we see that Lates generally had a better, happier life than Thurstans, I think it's quite nice that Thurstans won the round this time and was immortalized. And so here is the masterpiece, Thurstans' masterpiece, which was always traditionally called Thurstans' 4-part. And the reason for that is that it divides very nicely into these 4 quarter peals. But really, from a mathematical sense, it's a 20-part. So I've underlined each of the 20 parts. And when you look, you can see that there's actually a lot more structure and repetition than you might detect at first glance. So it's actually much easier to learn than it looks at first glance. Now, the 20 part ends in the peal, 6 and 7, always the observation bells. So they always come back to their home positions at the end of the part ends. And so it's bells 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that take part in the part ends and move around. Here we have bell number 1 is moved to the back. So we get 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 here. Same thing happens this time. 2 is moved to the back. So we get 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 6, 7. And the same thing here. 3 moves to the back. 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. And so these are all sort of rotations of rounds on 5 bells. Quite easy to spot. So just very similar to rounds. Here we have a similar thing happening with reverse rounds. So we've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 6, 7. And then again, we move the first bell to the back. So then we get 4, 3, 2, 1, 5. Same thing again, move the 4 to the back, 3, 2, 1, 5, 4. And here we've got 2, 1, 5, 4, 3. So these are like the rounds part ends, but instead we've got the rotations of reverse rounds on 5 bells. And here we get queens on 5 bells, 1, 3, 5, 2, 4. Again, move the treble to the back, 3, 5, 2, 4, 1. Again, same thing happening. So these are all the rotations of queens. And then here we've got titums, 1, 4, 2, 5, 3. Again, all of these rotations of titums, quite similar to titums. So it's very elegant aesthetic feature that the 20 part ends are all based on familiar changes on 5 bells. Now, the red bobs that I've marked here, these always cause a cyclic pair of bells to dodge together at the back. So whenever there's a red bob, one of these pairs of bells, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, always dodge together at the back at the red bobs, and that's a very useful feature for the conductor. It's also quite useful that these red bobs occur early on in the part and near each other as well. That's quite a useful feature. The blue bobs in the second half of the peal, instead, these cause a queen's pair of bells to dodge together at the back. So 1, 3, 3, 5, 5, 2, 2, 4. Now, these might not seem as easy to spot as the more intuitive cyclic sort of consecutive bells, but these are just the non-cyclic bells, if you like. So it's just a process of elimination. So the blue bobs, those queensy pairs always dodge together at the back. And this gap between the blue bobs, you do get a pair of cyclic consecutive bells dodging together at the back. So that's another useful feature as well. And as I said earlier, bells 6 and 7 are the observation bells in the composition. So they do the same thing again and again in each part. There's lots of useful signposts with what bells 6 and 7 are doing. And at the green bobs, you always get bell number 6 dodging at the back at the green bobs. And this is a stretch of 4 consecutive bobs. So for that period of 4 consecutive bobs, you always get 6 dodging at the back, which is another really useful signpost for the conductor. In fact, some conductors actually conduct the peal off the 6th as well. Now, earlier on, right at the very, very start, we looked at these 3 part ends here, where bells 2, 3, 4 are rotating and the other bells are left unaffected. 3-part group. But then we saw that that is actually just a subgroup of this larger group of 9 part ends. So we put this into the 9 part ends, and this is still a group as well. And so you'd think on that basis that the 20 part ends in Thurstan's peal would be a subgroup of Hudson's 60 part ends. Remember that the twin bob peals are all on Hudson's 60 part ends that we looked at the beginning of the presentation. So you'd think that these 20 part ends would be a subgroup of that larger group of 60 part ends, but they aren't, because if we look at Hudson's group again, we can only see half of the Thurstan's part ends inside Hudson's group. In red, we've got the rounds ones, the cyclic rotations of rounds at the top here. And underneath, we've got the cyclic rotations of back rounds. So what's going on? Where are the other 10 part ends? And the reason is that Hudson's group only contains positive bell rows. So in ringing, we have positive bell rows, which means that that bell row would require an even number of call changes to get back to rounds. And we have negative bell rows, which require an odd number of call changes to get back to rounds. And they're exactly half of positive and exactly half negative rows for all numbers of bell changes. And so Hudson's group only contains positive rows and is only half of a larger double group of 120 part ends. And so here's the other half of Hudson's group, which contains negative rows, and it's called the projective linear group. And to work out what these extra 60 negative part ends are, is you would ring Hudson's peal, which we looked at earlier, and then if you rang the same peal backwards from handstroke to backstroke to handstroke instead of handstroke to backstroke, that would then produce the other half of the peal. And then, lo and behold, we look and we find here are the missing part ends from Thurstan's 20 part hidden in the negative part ends from this group. And I think it's a testament to the brilliance of both Lates and Thurstans that they were using this whole double group of 120 part ends instead of just using Hudson's group of 60 part ends. So Lates and Thurstans are really twisting the courses into really unusual shapes and ringing bits of courses backwards and all that kind of thing. And it's very interesting they were doing this at such an early stage when the twin bob plan was so new, because since Lates and Thurstans, very few people, hardly anyone at all, has used the whole group of 120. Generally, all subsequent peals have just been based on Hudson's 60-part group. So I really think that shows how clever Lates and Thurstans were. Because 20-part compositions are quite rare in ringing, I thought I'd just have a little digression about these, if you'll bear with me. And so we get, just like Hudson's group, is sort of beneath the surface a little bit and appears in various guises in ringing composition. So this 20-part group also appears in different areas of ringing composition if you dig deep enough to find it. And it can be described, it's got many different names in mathematics, the general affine group, for example, and it can also be algebraically, mathematically described in different ways as well, constructed in different ways. And so the first ever 20-part composition, ringing composition composed, it was almost certainly the one by Lates that we looked at, this 20-part peal of Stedman Triples. And we know that Thurstans composed a false 20-part peal the year before this was composed. So we don't know whether it was Thurstans' idea or Lates' idea. Could have been Thurstans' idea, but Lates was successful with the first true composition. So who came first, the ringers or the mathematicians with the 20-part group? Well, unfortunately, Galois definitely did come first with Thurstans' group this time. He was an expert with the groups on, it can be rung on 5 bells, and he died in 1832, which was several years before Lates' peal appeared. So unfortunately, the mathematicians beat the ringers this time. Now, in Cambridge Minor, we've got here the plain course of Cambridge Minor in black, the 10 backstroke and handstroke lead ends of Cambridge Surprise Minor. And this red course here starts from 145-326 and has a very special, unique relationship with the plain course. And in the plain course of Cambridge Minor, you do not get the change reverse rounds. You do not get the change 6-5-4-3-2-1, but you do get it in the red course here. And that's because every change that occurs in the plain course of Cambridge Minor occurs in the red course upside down. So if we look, for example, here, 1-4-6-2-5-3 in the plain course, we would get this upside down in the red course, 3-5-2-6-4-1. And this is because the 10 lead backstroke and handstroke lead ends of the plain course added to the 10 backstroke and handstroke lead ends of the red course make Thurstans' 20-part group. So that's why there's this special, unique relationship between these two courses. And this is sometimes useful in ringing composition. For example, John Warboy's ingenious peals of splice treble dodging minor make use of this relation between these two courses. As does this fiendish method here, Sir Catherine Cree minor, which we named earlier this year in February, although it doesn't feel like this year, of course. And this has got 360 changes in the plain course. And the only way you can ring a true 720 of it is to, after you rung the plain course, ring the red course, because just like in Cambridge Minor, the plain course of St. Catherine Cree compares to the red course by having all of the changes rung upside down. So that's how you ring a true 720 of this method. Although unfortunately you can't actually join the red course and the black course together, so you have to find ingenious or funny ways of joining the courses together and cheat a little bit. Now, I was amazed in 2011, it's almost 10 years ago now, but I'm still amazed that you can have 20-part peals of Granser triples. So just like the 20 parts we looked at of Stedman triples by Thurstans and people, you can do the same thing in Granser triples. And it appears that no one had done this in Granser triples prior to 2011. So even it's almost 10 years on, it still fascinates me this is possible in Granser triples. And it's quite appropriate. We first rung this at Dodderhill in Droitwich. So obviously that's on the way to Birmingham. So it's quite nice that we rang it not too far away from Birmingham, where the first 20 part of anything was ever composed. And the way you join the 4 quarter peals together is at these linkage points here. And in this variation, the two linkage points occur even closer together, which is quite nice because it means that this variation feels even closer to an authentic 20-part. And it was also interesting that you can get a 20-part peal of plain bob triples as well, which I discovered last year. It was actually harder to compose than the Grancer triples peal, which is unusual because bob triples is usually much easier. So yeah, again, it's just interesting that the 20-part format for Stedman triples can work for plain bob triples as well. So you'll be relieved to know this is the end of the technical section. Hope everyone's still awake. And it's also the end of the Stedman triples story as well. So to finish with, I'll just talk briefly now, not long till the end. I'll just talk briefly about two more Birmingham composers who are quite interesting, just as a way of winding down, just as a way of cleansing the palate. And so we start with Elijah Roberts. So not to be confused with the ice hockey player of today, Elijah Roberts was another 19th century Birmingham composer. Unfortunately, none of his compositions actually survive, so we don't know what he was like as a composer. Although I say unfortunately, you're probably relieved that means I'm not able to talk about his compositions. He learnt to ring at an early age and was described by Thomas Day as a nice lad with bright and keen blue eyes and a very determined nature. He attempted his first peal at the age of 13, but he wasn't strong enough to ring even the second bell at Aston for a peal, so he had to come back and they rang the peal when he was 15. Roberts is most famous for being a genius at tapping peals on sets of handbells, so just him on his own, tapping out a whole peal on his own on handbells. He became landlord of the Union Tavern in Jamaica Row, and this became the main drinking hub for the Birmingham ringers. And here he tapped a peal of Stedman Sinks on handbells, conducted by Henry Cooper, though the composition was one of Roberts' own compositions. And there was a very large gathering of ringers for this in the next room, including the great Henry Johnson, who was able to testify the validity of the peal. And I think that quite apart from how impressive it is to tap any kind of changes on 12 bells and make sure you always hit the right bell and know which bell to tap and all this kind of thing, I think what's even more impressive with Stedman Sinks is the fact that the bells get so mixed up into different combinations. So this would have made the problem even more difficult. But his greatest achievement was in 1837, when he tapped a peal of 19,440 changes of Kent Treble Bob Maximus at a pub in Liverpool, and this took him 13 hours and 43 minutes of non-stop tapping. There were no expert ringers present this time, but the neighbours next door testified that the bells rang from morning till night, so we can be fairly confident that the peal was tapped accurately. And on another occasion, he tapped a peal of treble bob 16 on 16 bells for 6 hours and 28 minutes. And on this occasion, he didn't even bother to bring the bells back into rounds at the end. So that's another brilliant achievement, tapping on 16 bells. And I think it's a shame that tap peals aren't recognized in some way or given more of a recognized status, official status, because these surely must be some of the greatest solo ringing performances of all time, if not some of the greatest ringing performances of all time. And I think that because of this, Roberts is really an unsung hero of Birmingham ringing and deserves wider recognition. Unfortunately, tragically, in 1865, he died by cutting his throat after he'd been drinking heavily for a fortnight. And the inquest established that this was a verdict of temporary insanity. And finally, we have Henry Johnson, a great Birmingham ringer and composer. Many of you will have heard the name, seen the name on peal boards in your area. And of course, your annual dinner is named after him as well. For good cause, because Henry Johnson seems to have been one of the most respected and most loved Birmingham ringers of his time. There is enough evidence that he was a very kind man with a pleasant manner, though he was very good at putting people in their place with a sharp tongue if people talked out of turn. He is also said to have had a remarkable memory and to have been a wonderful mimic as well, so he was able to entertain people for hours in his company. He conducted most of the famous peals rung in Birmingham during the period he was active for, and he conducted most of the longer length peals, the famous peals, and he usually called his own compositions for these. Johnson is best remembered as a Stedman Caters and Sinks composer. He dabbled actually a little bit in the Stedman Triples saga between Lates and Thurstans that we looked at earlier on. He made a little contribution here, but not much. He was really more of a Caters and Sinks composer, and he composed in all of the popular methods of the day. When he was a young conductor, he asked Thomas Thurstans, who was about the same age as Johnson, he asked Thurstans to prove one of Johnson's compositions, because of course there are no computers in those days to computer-proof peal compositions. But unfortunately, the composition did turn out to be false after they had rung the peal, so Johnson never trusted Thurstans again in this way. And this is said to be the pivotal moment where Johnson vowed to trust no one except himself as to the truth of his compositions. So he learnt the art and science of knowing whether a composition is true or not, and he got to the stage where he could tell just at a glance whether a composition was true or false. Quote, so I don't really need to share my screen again. So I think it'd be nice to end. There was this article written in 1988 by Alan Burbage, another notable Birmingham composer, of course, not quite as far back as the other ones I've talked about. And he wrote this nice article in 1988 about Henry Johnson. And he says, in the ringing room of St. Peter and St. Paul Aston, where Johnson first learnt to ring in 1826, there hangs high on the wall an enormous photograph showing the man in his late years, bearded and kindly. Lower down in a small frame is a copy in his own hand of a date touch of Grand Sir Triples for 1890, possibly his last composition. Thus, in a subtle way, are two harmonious sides of the man depicted, a giant renowned through the world of change ringing, and a modest local man composing a date touch, and most probably at someone's request for once-off use. So that is Henry Johnson, and that is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Richard. I have to say, I'm relieved you're back. Yeah, thank you very much. That was a really thorough, really interesting and in-depth talk about about some of Birmingham's most notable composers and compositions. I have another question, but again, just encourage people, either type in the chat box or raise your hand or unmute yourself. Please do. I think Richard would be keen to hear questions. But my question is this, Richard. How far do you think that Birmingham Birmingham composers led in the field of compositions? Obviously, you mentioned Hudson in Sheffield, but how far do you think Birmingham sort of broke new ground on compositions, or can you think of another place where there was such a collection of composers working together?
I really think in many ways Birmingham was the leading place in the 19th century, or certainly the first half of the 19th century. Certainly with Stedman Triples, as I said about after Thurstan's four-part was composed, all composition activity in Stedman Triples ceased for the next several decades, really until the later years of the 19th century, when other composers in the south of England, in the home counties and things, they started to pick up the twin bob composition plan again. And so it was certainly for many decades, Birmingham was leading environment for Stedman Triples compositions. As to other methods, it's hard to say, but Henry Johnson, as I mentioned at the end, was a very popular composer. He composed in lots of the standard methods. So lots of people called his compositions of Stedman Caters and Sinks. And then there was a slightly later composer who I haven't mentioned, John Carter. He sort of really revolutionized Stedman Sinks and Stedman Caters. So in the very end of the 1900s, through really to the 1920s and things, he became a very, very popular Stedman Caters and Sinks composer, was John Carter. So I really think there was a long continued period for which Birmingham was a leading area for composing. And I think it's quite hard to think of anywhere else really, which was so concentrated in that respect. So I hope that was the kind of answer you were looking for.
That's good. Yeah, thank you. Or anything that promotes Birmingham, I'm always happy to hear. No, that was great. Thank you. A couple of things coming through in the chat box. Christine says it'd be interesting to know more about the crossover of mathematics and bell ringing. I think that's probably a really big topic that would probably benefit from more time on another evening. Actually, I think I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think that's probably a thing that probably needs to be done separately, I guess.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because it was a coincidence. It was just a few months ago during lockdown. I've been looking into how early groups like Hudson's group of 60 part ends had been known to mathematicians and things like that. And it's nice to know that ringers probably got in first with that one. So yeah, I agree. It's very interesting to see the parallel journey between the ringing history and the mathematical history. And I think we'll find that many of the in many cases, it will be the ringers who got there first with the mathematical groups and things like that.
You have to be careful, Richard. I might be twisting your arm to come back.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to explore. I'm not a mathematician, so there's someone more qualified with group theory and graph theory and all that kind of pure mathematics would be quite good at doing that research, I think. And interestingly, on that note, there's very little mentioned about ringing on the Wikipedia page about group theory. And this page about group theory, it mentions the various applications in life where group theory appears. But there's no mention of ringing at all on that Wikipedia page, which is a bit of a shame, I think.
Oh, thank you. Simon asks, tapped peals, is there any record of all known performances of tapped peals?
I don't know. Honestly, don't know. It might be they've been referred to unofficially somewhere, so you might have the different information unofficially, and you'd have to work harder to gather it all. There's this website, Chain Ringing Wiki, about notable ringing performances and that kind of thing. I think there's quite a lot on this Chain Ringing Wiki website which mentions solo ringing performances and things like that by various people have performed. So there's a little bit there you can find information, I think.
Yeah, super, thank you. David Bavistock asks, more recently we had a comparable competition for a competition of Stedman 7 triples with bobs only, or was it comparable? What's the next candidate for compositional competition?
Yeah, I agree. That was a recent example of a competition in Stedman triples for who would come first with this revolutionary composition. And that was actually quite controversial as well, although obviously it was much more recently in the 1990s. So you have to be a bit careful what you say about it because it was a bit more recent. But yeah, that's a really good modern example of a competition. And I was actually going to mention it in my presentation because in twin bob peals, like I described, you have to have at least 2 singles in that kind of composition. So it's nice that what Thurstans achieved, he still achieved the best kind of twin bob composition because you have to have 2 singles in that kind of composition. So it's nice that when the first properly bobs only peal of Stedman triples was composed in the 90s, this didn't really supersede Thurstans peal for that reason because it's on a completely different plan to the twin bob plan. Yeah.
There's lots of chat coming through around group theory and papers by John Leary and sort of Martin Bright under Holdroyd, sort of those sort of people involved in group theory. So again, I think this is definitely a topic we probably need to come back to at some point.
Yeah, probably exceeding my qualifications, but I'm definitely interested to see how the research goes in that field.
Super. Well, that's everything in the chat box so far. I mean, Susan's asked about handbell peals. Yes, Susan, just look on Bellboard handbell peel records. Yeah, sorry, David. Yes, and Holdroyd. So unless there's anything else, I will just take this opportunity to promote next week quickly whilst we have a captive audience. And then, if there's any last-minute things people want to ask, now be the time to raise your hand or type into the chat box. next week we weren't going to have a session, actually. We're going to have half term, but I had an offer by John Lovelace, who has just written a biography of George Pipe. Now, George Pipe, obviously the Pipe family have really strong connections to Birmingham, as many of you know, obviously through Rod Pipe and then his son David and David's family. George the Pipes have strong connections to Birmingham anyway, and George himself is just a fascinating man with so many different talents and interests. So I think that'd be a really interesting talk by John about his biography, and an opportunity, obviously, for John to talk more about his research and sell his work. So hopefully you can come along to that next week. I think, Richard, that's everything. Last chance if anyone wants to wave frantically at me, or so I think in that case, Richard, on behalf of the St Martin's Guild and on behalf of everyone here tonight, thank you so much for all the work you put into tonight's talk. There's lots of chat. Sorry, actually, before I forget, a couple of people emailed me to say that they can't come tonight, but they're really interested in watching this talk online. Lucy Woodward and Jack Page in particular. So again, sort of hellos from them. But I think you've got lots of chat coming through, thanking you. And again, as I say, on my behalf, thank you very much for everything you've done for us tonight.
Pleasure. I hope it wasn't boring at all. Or a bit
far from it, I think people would say.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I've been enjoying watching many of these talks as well. There's some really interesting talks previously, so I've enjoyed watching them.
Super. Lovely. You've gone awesome from Susan.
Thank you, Susan.
Super. So I'm going to stop recording.